Welcome to tonight's slow history, where the shutter opens not onto the living, but onto the stillness of the newly dead, where memory meets mechanics, and mourning becomes something silver and permanent. There was a time not long ago when the last breath did not end a person's presence in the family home or in the rituals of the day. It simply marked a transition, a change in stillness from sleeping to something deeper, and with the arrival of the daguerreotype around 1839, a strange new possibility appeared for those left behind, a portrait of the dead to keep them close in ways paint and sketch never could. Something about the silver image caught grief just right, soft shadows clinging to the hollow of the cheek, the quiet curve of the mouth still slack with surrender. The daguerreotype, unlike painting, required no interpretation. It only required light and patience and silence and death. You see, portraiture before photography was slow, expensive, often reserved for the wealthy, and the well-known. To sit for a painter was to wait weeks, sometimes months, for a likeness that might not truly resemble. You might instead show who you wished to be, rather than who you were, but photography made the gaze honest, and post-mortem photography made the dead stay present in a world that was shifting too fast into industry, into noise, into motion. Victorians living in soot and progress and steam needed something still to hold on to in grief. The daguerreotype did not flinch, it did not beautify, it did not lie. It showed the closed eyes, the clasped hands, the body made eternal in the second death of the shutter click. At first, these photographs were not considered strange, not the way we might think of them now. They were precious final glimpses. They were sometimes displayed on mantelpieces, or kept in lockets, even passed from hand to hand. At funerals, a mother holding a small tin image of her daughter, lips just barely parted, as if still breathing, a husband keeping the framed image of his wife beside the bed. They had once shared. The dead were not banished from the domestic world in the way they are now. Their bodies were often washed, dressed, and laid out in the parlor for viewing. The photograph simply extended that visit a few more years, or perhaps forever. What made post-mortem photography rise was not only grief, but affordability. The process of making a daguerreotype, while expensive at first, soon became available to the middle classes, cheaper than commissioning a painting, more intimate than a written eulogy, and often the only image ever taken of the person, especially of children for whom time had not allowed a living portrait to be made. Infant mortality remained tragically high in the 19th century, and so the first and only photograph a parent might have of their baby was taken after the crying had stopped and the tiny hands had curled forever into fists around nothing. The dead were posed with care, sometimes laid in beds to appear as if simply napping, sometimes seated propped with hidden stands, or lean gently against chairs. Siblings gathered around, with stiff expressions, meant not just to hold their own grief, but to stay perfectly still during the long exposure time required for the image to form. Sometimes eyes were painted on closed lids to give the illusion of wakefulness. Sometimes cheeks were subtly tinted with pigment to recall the blush of life. What we might call deception, the Victorians called devotion to them. Photograph was not a record of death, but a preservation of presence. The body still here, the memory held in silver and shadow studios, began to specialize in these portraits, with backdrops chosen not to celebrate life, but to frame loss. Appropriately drawn curtains, a table with a single flower, a crucifix on the wall, to remind viewers that death was not the end, but a doorway and still the dead, posed not in coffins or graves, but upright, seated, alert, almost watching the living, even as the living tried to remember them as they were, and not as they had become. It was a paradox made sacred by the lens, a still life that was once truly life. As photography improved, so too did the styles and expectations around mourning photography. Tintypes replaced daguerreotypes, glass negatives allowed for multiple prints, carte de visite albums began to include not just weddings and baptisms, but also the quiet solemnity of death moments. Children grew up flipping through these pages, finding their relatives, both living and gone, indistinguishable at times, in the same bindings and borders and posies. Death was part of the family record, not erased, not hidden, but caught in the same gaze as the rest. There were photographers who became known for their gentle handling of the dead, not just as subjects but as stories. They would ask for details of the person's life, arrange props that spoke to their interests or personality, a book in the lap of a scholar, a rosary for the devout, a small toy for the child who never learned to walk. Each image was an act of translation, turning absence into presence, grief into artifact, mourning into something tangible enough to hold and perhaps to heal. We sometimes ask, why? Why would anyone want a photograph of someone already gone? But this question misunderstands the purpose. The photograph was not only for the moment, it was for the years to come, for the anniversaries and the long winters and the quiet hours, when memory fades and detail blurs. The image anchored the person to the world of the living. It gave grief a face to speak to. It gave silence a shape. The image didn't deny the death. It made space for it in the living room, on the shelf, in the palm of the hand. Some families posed themselves with the deceased, not as macabre spectacle, but as final communion. A mother holding her son as if he'd merely fallen asleep. A husband touching his wife's shoulder with the restraint of those who know what has already passed. Siblings standing around their sister, eyes focused not on the lens, but on her face, as if trying to memorize her for whatever comes next. These images tell stories in the tilt of a head, the clasp of a hand, the choice to be near or the inability to look away. They speak of loss, but also of love, stubborn, unflinching. And of course, there were critics even then, those who found the practice ghoulish, who believed death should be hidden, made private, turned into something sterile and removed. But they were in the minority in the age of high mourning and black crepe. The image was not grotesque. It was sacred, a relic of the heart's refusal to let go. Mourning was not a quiet thing. It was not a phase. It was an identity. And the photograph made it visible, made it official, gave it weight. We must also consider the spiritual context. The 19th century was a time of religious anxiety and exploration. Traditional faiths were being questioned and reshaped. Spiritualism began to rise. Mediums, the belief that the veil between worlds was thin. Photography fit into this perfectly. A mechanical proof of presence, a captured ghost, even before spirit photography took hold. Post-mortem portraits suggested something else, something between life and death, a body not yet forgotten, a soul, perhaps, still hovering the image, became a space where belief and grief intertwined. Photographers sometimes traveled to homes, bringing their equipment to the bedside of the dying, or the freshly passed, setting up tripods between family heirlooms, adjusting light around the face of the beloved gone. Still, the ritual of taking the photograph became its own form of mourning. Slow, precise, reverent, like washing the body or saying the final prayers, and for many, this moment became the funeral itself, more intimate than a sermon, more enduring than flowers laid on a grave. Some cultures adopted the practice differently. In Mexico, for instance, the Day of the Dead blurred the line between life and loss long before cameras arrived, and once photography became available, images of the dead were integrated into altars and celebrations, not as mourning, but as presence, the dead not gone, but just elsewhere, watching, remembering, being. Remembered, the camera did not frighten them. It invited them to stay. In other traditions, especially among African American communities, post-mortem photographs became a way to honor lives, often denied recognition in public spaces. A portrait of dignity in death, when life had offered so little of it. These images resisted erasure, resisted the narrative that only certain lives were worth remembering. Photography became reclamation, a visual archive of love despite it all. And still, for many, it was simple, not political or theological, just deeply personal. A picture to carry a picture, to hold a picture, to whisper, to when sleep would not come. The image never aged, it never moved, it never changed, and in that stillness there was a comfort, a stability the living rarely offered the dead. Always still, the photograph waited. We look now at these images with curiosity, perhaps with discomfort, seeing in them a time when grief was not hidden, when love did not flinch from death, and we wonder what it might be like to return to that, to sit with the dead, not in fear, but in memory, to take their picture not as spectacle, but as prayer, and in that shutter click to hear, not silence, but presence, soft and unending. From where and when are you watching tonight? Death in the Victorian household was not a guest, but a tenant one, who paid no rent, and never knocked twice, and as the sun set behind lace-curtained windows and clocks ticked a little more solemnly, the presence of mortality folded itself into the rhythm of domestic life, where the dead did not leave at the moment of last breath, but lingered in the parlor, sat in silence among family, and watched as the rituals unfolded. One by one, in slow, deliberate order, with the precision of grief, held in porcelain teacups and trimmed velvet drapes. It is easy to forget now, in this antiseptic modern world, that once death was not a stranger carted away on wheels of authority, but a member of the household, dressed and groomed by familiar hands, and kept close for one last gaze under candlelight. They had their reasons. The Victorians, those stoic dreamers wrapped in crape in contradiction for making death such a present companion for them, mourning was not just an emotion, but an institution, a culture, a duty written in black silk and bound with jet buttons. Entire industries existed to support it, the mourning warehouses of London, selling everything from veils to stationery embossed with funereal borders, and yes, even hair jewelry, because the lock of a beloved's hair woven into a bracelet was not seen as morbid, but tender. It was the last thread one might hold on to after all else. had faded and turned to ash. The very etiquette of grief was codified and watched. Widows were expected to mourn for 2 full years, with their attire gradually shifting in tone from dull black to grey to lilac, a chromatic scale of sorrow, calibrated for public consumption. And behind this carefully curated ritual sat a truth both deeply human and quietly haunting, that death was ordinary. Inside these homes, children were taught to whisper when the dying were near. Doors were shut, windows draped, clocks stopped at the hour of passing to freeze time in its most sacred rupture, and mirrors were covered with cloth, lest they trap the soul still lingering in the room. The body of the deceased usually remained in the home for several days, lovingly prepared by family or neighbors, who understood that touch was a final language. Hands were washed, faces gently closed with coins or weights placed upon the eyes to hold shut what no longer needed to see, the hair combed, clothing changed, and the dead laid out in the best room of the house, sometimes the parlor, sometimes a bedroom. Candles flickered beside them, often in pairs, symbolizing the soul's passage between this world and the next. And there they rested, not in isolation, but among the living, who came to sit and speak and sometimes laugh. Because death was sad, yes, but it was not always solemn. The wake was a vigil, not only of tears, but of presence. Food was served, tea poured, stories told, children allowed to peek in, respectfully even touch the hands of the deceased, to understand that this too was part of living. Some families draped the room in black, some preferred flowers and white cloths. And always there was the photograph, or soon there would be. Because, as we have already touched upon in the prior chapter, the rise of photography changed how the Victorians mourned and remembered. Now death could be captured not only in memory but in image, and the post-mortem photograph taken in the home became a natural extension of these rituals, a way to hold on just a little longer to the face that had smiled and breathed and spoken only days before. But even before the photograph, there were drawings, hairwork, and handwritten elegies pressed into family Bibles, entire pages dedicated to births, marriages, and yes, death, inked carefully with dates and times, and sometimes a small note of comfort or divine reference. We have lost her to God, escaping, or simply she sleeps. The dead were not gone, they were away. And while that distinction may seem like denial to us now, it held power in a time when belief was both bomb and structure. A child who died in infancy might be remembered as an angel returned to heaven. A father lost to fever would be said to walk beside his widow in spirit, seen only in dreams and shadows. These were not superstitions in the dismissive sense, but necessary architectures of emotional survival, grief channeled through ritual and form, made bearable by the performance of meaning. Inside the Victorian household, even architecture responded to death. Staircases widened to accommodate coffins. Parlors, sometimes referred to as death rooms, were arranged with specific attention to where the body would be placed and how mourners might gather around it. There was an intimacy to this spatial relationship, one that modern funeral parlors have rendered clinical, but which once felt natural, necessary. Even doors opened to receive condolences, Neighbors stopped by with food gloves were worn when mourning, and the mourning period itself could be a badge of honor, a visible sign of depth of feeling, but also a social cue that protected the bereaved from expectations of levity or speed. Grief, in its drawn-out display, was understood as part of healthful mourning, not weakness. Children, too, were not spared from death's visibility. They played near the room where the deceased was laid. They wore mourning clothes, often scaled-down versions of adult garb. They were given symbols to help understand loss, a locket with a portrait or a tiny ribbon in black, and they were spoken to not always with euphemism, but with the strange clarity that sometimes accompanies tradition. She has gone to sleep, they were told. But the sleep was understood to be deeper than any dream, and this early exposure to mortality, however jarring, gave them a vocabulary for grief, one shaped by continuity, not avoidance. Women played central roles in these rituals, as they did in so many unseen labors of the Victorian household. It was often the mother, sister, or aunt who prepared the dead for display, who hosted the mourners, who wrote the obituary or kept the journal. It was women who carried the weight of appropriate mourning behavior, who taught their daughters when to wear gloves, when to lift the veil, how long to bow their heads, and when to begin speaking again after loss. And while this might seem oppressive through modern eyes, it was also a form of agency. To hold the script of grief was to wield some power over chaos. There were, of course, darker corners to this domestic relationship with death. The hidden pregnancies, the silent stillbirths, the infants buried quietly in gardens because their lives had not yet been counted, the unmarked graves of servants or the impoverished who passed without coin for a coffin, and the mental toll of such constant intimacy with mortality cannot be underestimated. Melancholia was a term used often and freely to describe the weight of bereavement. Depression, though not understood as we understand it now, shaped lives and households, sometimes leading to seclusion, to illness, to what Victorians called nervous disorders, treated with rest or travel, or sometimes simply endured in silence. The spiritual dimension was never far. Religion permeated not just the funeral, but the framing of the death itself. Prayers were said upon passing, scripture read aloud, hymns sung by candlelight. Some believed in visions of angels at the deathbed, others in the presence of those who had passed before, welcoming the dying into eternity. The moment of death was not just an end, but a threshold. And while the exact nature of the beyond varied by denomination and belief, the idea that death was not the final word was nearly universal. Even among skeptics, the dead held meaning. Skeptics, who might reject the literal truths of heaven or hell, still found in the rituals of death a kind of secular sacredness, a respect for the end of a life, however modest, and for the memory that life left behind. And it is in this space, between faith and doubt, between sorrow and celebration, that the Victorian household held its most quiet beauty, a recognition that to grieve was not weakness, but witness, that to mourn was not to wallow, but to mark a passage. And in the slow, quiet hours after the guests had left, the candles burned low and the family sat alone with their dead. There was often a stillness so complete, felt like time itself had paused. Some wrote letters to the deceased. Some read from the Bible or from a favorite book. Some simply sat and looked at the face they had loved one last time, knowing that soon the body would be taken to its final rest. and the house would change again from a place of death to a place of memory. And the transformation was not abrupt but gradual, like breath slowing after tears. In those moments the walls held silence but not emptiness. The furniture bore the imprint of mourning, and the very air remembered hymns sung and sighs. Released, the dead did not vanish entirely. Their presence lingered not in ghostly form necessarily, but in the continuation of ritual, in the stories told at dinner, in the way someone placed their gloves on the mantel or folded a shawl just so, and it is in these repetitions that we begin to understand how death lived in the Victorian household, not as interruption, but as rhythm, as one more chapter in the book of family life. As the century turned and modernity crept into every corner with its hospitals and its funeral homes and its antiseptic logic, the place of death in the home diminished. The rituals grew quieter, briefer. More clinical grief became less public, and the dead were increasingly hidden from view. But in the sepia-tinted photographs and the surviving letters and journals, the old rhythms still speak. They remind us that once to die at home was not a failure, but a return, that once the body was not a thing to fear but to honor, and that once mourning was not a solitary burden but a communal act of love. And so as we drift from this memory into the next, as the image of a lace-covered mirror and a quiet parlor with a single candle flickering begins to fade, we carry with us a sense of what was lost, and perhaps what could be remembered, not the costumes or the rigid etiquette, but the presence, the care, the belief that to sit with the dead was to sit with love, that death in the Victorian household was not just an end but a final act of devotion, a scene composed with quiet grace. The body would be still before the lens, long before the shutter opened. That stillness was expected. It was helpful. It meant fewer mistakes. In the earliest years of photography in the mid-19th century, when chemicals whispered their alchemy onto polished metal and the daguerreotypist crouched behind a black velvet curtain, the stylist subject was the most cooperative one. The living fidgeted and blinked and shifted their weight under the burden of minutes-long exposures, but the dead did not move, and so they became perfect in a way. Perfect for the image, perfect for remembrance, perfect for holding, still long enough to be frozen, not in spirit, but in silver. The first methods were slow and strange. The daguerreotype, introduced in 1839, was a marvel and a mirror. A copper plate coated with silver, iodide, sensitized with fumes, exposed to light for long seconds or minutes, then fixed with mercury vapor, and sealed behind glass. It produced only one image. It could not be duplicated. It was delicate and luminous and frightening in its clarity. The eyes stared back, not like paint or pencil, but like truth. And when the eyes no longer opened in life, the camera held them open in memory. Families would bring their dead to the studio, or invite the photographer into their parlors. Children wrapped in lace, infants cradled by grieving mothers, old men dressed in their Sunday best, propped in chairs as if they might speak again at any moment. But the daguerreotype was not alone for long. Soon came the ambrotype, with its image suspended on glass, darker and moodier in tone. Then the tintype printed on iron, more affordable and popular with working families. Each method brought new opportunities and new illusions. The dead could be made to appear as if merely asleep. With careful posing and the right light, even a lifeless face could seem gentle, thoughtful, composed. Some photographers painted open eyes onto closed lids. Others supported the body with hidden stands or frames, devices borrowed from the trade of portraiture, but now pressed into posthumous service. Iron neck braces, shoulder supports, padded chairs with footrests, all designed not to honor the living, but to animate the dead just enough to keep them believable. These techniques were not macabre to the families who requested them. They were reverent, practical, tender. Death came often and came fast. It took children before their names had settled. It took wives before wedding sheets were laundered. It took mothers in childbirth and fathers in factory accidents and grandparents. Simply because the seasons changed, there was rarely time for paintings or the cost of commissions. Photography offered a brief, flickering chance at holding on, and so the mechanics of the medium became rituals of remembrance. A cloth to wipe the face, a touch of rouge to warm the cheeks, a comb for the hair, a camera for the soul. In some studios, specialized equipment was kept on hand for these portraits. Weighted tripods, dark curtains, painted backdrops that evoked comfort or heaven or the homely heart. The dead were posed beside clocks, books, Bibles, or flowers. Always flowers, lilies, roses. Sometimes the image would be touched by hand afterward. Color added to the cheeks, the lips, the eyes, a tint of pink, a drop of blue, to make them seem more alive, not for deception, but for beauty. And in that gentle falseness, a truth remained. Photographers learned to work quickly. The dead did not decay more slowly for the sake of art. Ice and fans and open windows helped, but time pressed in regardless. Exposure times shortened as technology improved, but the principle remained. Pose, focus, wait, fix, rinse, mount. Sometimes the subject was photographed lying down, as if asleep in bed or resting peacefully on a sofa. Other times they were propped up beside the living, hands gently arranged, eyes closed if they had not been painted open. Siblings sat beside their departed brothers. Husbands held the hands of wives who would never speak again. The image did not record movement, only presence, and in the absence of breath, presence was all that could be hoped for. Mourning attire played a part in the composition. Widows in black veils, children in white frocks, fathers in starched collars, hands clenched just out of frame. These were not celebrations. They were ceremonies of stillness. The clothing marked a moment as much as the camera did. In some portraits, the entire family would dress in matching dark garb, as if to show unity in sorrow. In others, the contrast between the living and the dead was emphasized. A pale infant held in the arms of a strong, teary-eyed mother, a boy in a coffin surrounded by toys. The staging may seem strange to modern eyes, but in its time it was tender. This was not horror, it was holding on. Some photographers specialized in death. They were discreet, efficient, gentle with the body, familiar with the ways to keep the limbs supple, the eyelids sealed, the expression soft. They knew how to light a scene, so that the shadows comforted rather than threatened. They had learned through repetition how to speak to grief, not with words, but with images that said, "Look, you loved them, and here they are, still, for now, just a little longer." Sometimes the subject was already in the coffin, the lid removed, the camera positioned above, flowers tucked into the folds of fabric, hands crossed, eyes closed. This was more common with infants, who could be cradled or swaddled. Older children might be posed sitting up, supported from behind by hidden braces, their siblings beside them with somber faces, told to stay still, not to smile, not to cry, just to be there. The photographs were often kept close, in lockets, in albums, on mantles. Sometimes they were the only image ever taken of the person, a final portrait rather than a retrospective. In this way, the technology became a kind of substitute for memory itself. If you forgot the curve of a cheek, the photograph remembered. If the voice faded, the eyes still stared back. For many, it was a comfort. For some, a small cruelty. Not everyone could look without flinching, but the image remained patient and precise. Not all these photographs were meant for display. Some were tucked away, too private, too sacred, a keepsake for a parent, a token for a spouse, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been loved. The image did not demand public recognition. It did not seek attention. It was a whisper in silver or glass or ink, a whisper that said, "Here, remember this, remember me." As photography grew more accessible, the methods changed again. Exposure times shortened. Cameras grew portable. More families could afford to have their own devices. But the impulse remained. To photograph the dead was not a fad. It was an answer to a question no one dared to ask aloud. How do we keep them? How do we hold something that has already gone? Even in the technique itself, there were metaphors. The chemical baths that fixed the image were like embalming. The glass plate was like a window, the image reversed, a mirror of what had been. The whole process was an act of transformation, from flesh to image, from moment to memory, and in that transformation, something strange and beautiful survived. Some critics at the time found the practice morbid. They wrote editorials warning against the overindulgence in grief. They worried that mourning was becoming performative, that death was being but for those who grieved, these images were not indulgent. They were necessary. They gave shape to sorrow. They offered a place for love to rest. And even now, in dusty albums and archive drawers, they remain. Silent, solemn, unblinking, the dead are still with us. The photographs seem to say, not in voice or movement, but in shadow and silver, in the way the light fell on a child's forehead, in the way a hand was folded just so, in the quiet skill of a photographer who knew how to turn loss into likeness. And perhaps that is why, despite all the changes in how we handle death today, these old photographs still draw our gaze. Not because they shock, but because they speak, because they remind us that even in the coldest stillness, there can be something warm, something worth remembering. It is difficult now, in the quiet comfort of electric light and antiseptic corridors, to remember how often children used to die, how often they came into the world with a gasp and left it with a sigh no one was prepared for. In the 19th century, especially in the long, heavy shadow of the Victorian age, infant death was a frequent guest in the nursery. It came wrapped in fever, or in stillness, or in the hushed urgency of a mother pressing a hand to her child as forehead and knowing, without needing words, that something had already changed. Doctors were few, remedies uncertain, prayer was common, but answers were not. And when the little body fell silent, the only response that made sense was to hold it a little longer, to keep it still, to keep it near, to ask a photographer to come quickly while the face still looked like the child you had known. These photographs are quiet things, small, sepia-toned, often worn at the edges from too much handling. They were not meant for display on parlor walls. They were kept in lockets, slipped between the pages of Bibles, tucked behind ribbons and folded letters. They do not show the grandeur of adult mourning, the velvet drapery and the formal poses. They are simpler, more tender. A baby posed as if sleeping, with one arm curled near the cheek. A little girl in a white gown, lying among flowers. A boy cradled in the arms of his mother, who tries not to weep, while holding still for the long exposure. These were images of love as much as loss. They were not made to frighten. They were made to remember. The poses were intentional. Sleeping was the most common, a gentle fiction that allowed the parent to imagine, if only for the length of a photograph, that their child was only resting. In some portraits, the child is laid out on a small bed or a pillow, arms folded or slightly bent, lips relaxed, eyes closed naturally. The face sometimes softened with powder, or the faintest touch of paint to the cheeks. Flowers were everywhere, not just for beauty, but for scent. Lilies to cover the smell of death, roses to signal innocence, daisies for purity. The flowers filled the frame almost as much as the child did, a blooming defiance in the face of loss. In other photographs, the child is held. This was often done for infants, too small to support themselves, or for children who had died suddenly and whose families had no other image of them. Mothers and fathers would hold their deceased child in their lap or against their chest. Sometimes they were fully visible, looking into the lens. Other times they were hidden, draped in dark cloth, becoming little more than a support, a shadow behind the child's fragile frame. There was comfort in the contact, and in the photograph that comfort became permanent, a last embrace, made into silver and paper. Sometimes the child was posed with their siblings, a brother sitting stiffly beside a sister who would never speak again, a toddler looking toward the camera, unaware of what had happened, while an infant sibling lay quiet in her arms. These images blur the line between life and death, between portrait and memorial. They ask us not to separate the living from the dead too harshly, to remember that love continued even when breath did not. For many Victorian families, this was not morbid, it was necessary. The photograph became a family's proof that the child had been, that they had existed, if only for a brief time. The photographers who specialized in these portraits understood their role. They arrived quietly. They moved carefully. They posed the body with a reverence, not unlike ritual. They knew how to use light to soften features, how to tilt a head just so, how to dress a scene in calmness and grace. They might spend an hour arranging flowers, brushing hair, adjusting fabric, not for vanity, but for memory, so that when the image was held years later, when the parents were older, when the siblings had children of their own, it would still feel like something real, something whole. In the earliest years, daguerreotypes were used, with their mirror-like surfaces and precise details. A child's eyelashes, the curve of their lip, the lace on a gown, all captured with haunting clarity. Later, tintypes and albumen prints became more common, easier to produce and less expensive. But the care remained. Whether on glass or iron or paper, the image carried weight. Not just the weight of grief, but of love suspended in time. Symbolism often found its way into these portraits. White clothing for purity, a cross or rosary to suggest innocence now at rest with God. A favorite toy placed gently in the child's hands. In some images, the child is shown with an open book, perhaps a Bible, suggesting wisdom beyond years, or perhaps simply stillness. These symbols weren't meant to explain. They were meant to soothe, to build a small story around the still body. A story that the family could tell themselves again and again. The Victorians were particularly skilled at layering meaning into mourning. There was a whole vocabulary of grief, expressed through clothing, behavior, even jewelry. Mourning rings set with the hair of the deceased, lockets engraved with initials, portraits hung in private rooms where visitors would not intrude. Photography joined this vocabulary not as a novelty, but as a necessity. It offered something more immediate than painting, more accurate than memory. And in the case of children, it often offered the only image that would ever exist. One cannot overlook the frequency of these photographs. Infant mortality in the 19th century was staggeringly high. Diseases we now vaccinate against, diphtheria, measles, smallpox, were often fatal. Sanitation was inconsistent. Medical care was limited. Death came fast and often unannounced. It was not unusual for a family to lose several children in succession, and so post-mortem photography became not a rare occurrence, but a quiet, sorrowful part of family life. Not every child who died was photographed, of course, but enough were that albums survive, full of these images, passed down through generations, not with horror, but with reverence. Over time, the practice began to wane. Advances in medicine reduced infant mortality. Attitudes toward death began to shift. The rise of funeral homes and professionalized mourning services moved death out of the home and into the hands of strangers. Photography became more about the living, about birthdays, vacations, weddings. Death was no longer seen as a proper subject. It became taboo, but the photographs remained, and in their quiet corners they continued to speak. Modern eyes often struggle with these images. There is discomfort, a sense that the line between love and morbidity has been crossed. But that discomfort may say more about our own distance from death. than about the images themselves. The Victorians did not see death as distant. They saw it as inevitable, intimate, ever-present, and their photographs reflect that intimacy. They show us how people grieved when grief was not hidden away, when it was allowed to take form, to take space, to be held and looked at and remembered. Sometimes the images show signs of retouching, a faint blush added to the cheeks, eyes drawn open, giving the illusion of wakefulness. These touches were not deceptions. They were gentle fictions, small acts of hope, not that the child was still alive, but that the love remained, that something soft could be held amid the sharpness of loss. And perhaps this is what makes these photographs so powerful, even now. They are not just documents, they are devotions. One can imagine the hands that held these images, the fingers that traced the outline of a face, the quiet moments in which the photograph was taken out, looked at, kissed, and returned to its place. These were acts of memory, repeated and sacred. And even though the child could not grow, could not speak, could not be held again, the image offered something close, a stillness that did not vanish. And in some way they linger still. In antique shops, in attics, in the archives of museums and collectors, they look out at us, these small, still faces, and they remind us of a time when grief was visible, when death was part of the home, when photography was not just about celebration, but about keeping what was most fragile from vanishing entirely. So we look. We pause, we breathe a little slower, and in doing so, we touch softly, respectfully, a grief that once was, and the love that still flickers quietly behind every frame. They did not always pose the dead alone. Sometimes the quietest grief was the one placed directly beside love, as if nothing had changed. In the sepia hush of 19th century parlor light, the line between life and death was not so cleanly drawn, not so insistently observed. Families gathered their dead not to mourn at a distance, but to sit beside them one last time, to look into the same camera lens and say, without saying, "We were here together." Even now, there is something gently unsettling about these photographs, not grotesque, not morbid, just ... off. A mother with one arm around a daughter whose shoulders slump too perfectly still. A husband seated beside a wife whose eyelids are dusted closed, her hand placed over his as if still in conversation. Children lined up with one sibling just a little too pale, lips a little too firm. These were not images of denial, though they sometimes read that way to us. They were acts of witness, of intimacy, of refusal to let death break the family frame. The Victorian era did not fear death in the way we do now. It feared forgetting, and in a time before video, before handheld snapshots and social media galleries, the family photograph was the only real archive of presence. To omit the dead from that archive felt like erasure. So they were included, sat upright, dressed in their Sunday best, surrounded by those who loved them. In some portraits, you cannot tell immediately who is dead and who is not. That, perhaps, was the point. There was a comfort in the illusion, in the warmth of shared stillness, in the idea that if the family could be gathered in this way, framed and captured and kept, then some thread still held, the body might still, the heart might stop, but the image could hold them all together, forever composed, no one missing, no one lost. Sometimes the dead child was cradled in a living mother's arms, both staring calmly into the camera. Other times, an elderly relative, already wrapped in the stillness of age, sat beside a son or sister gone too soon. Photographers learned to work around the silence, to build poses that honored both stillness and breath. In some cases, the dead were supported by hidden stands or propped discreetly. In others, they simply lay in beds or cradles, surrounded by those who were trying their best to smile. It was not easy to hold a pose for a long exposure when your heart was breaking, but the family did it anyway. Out of duty, out of love, out of the strange human hope that grief might lessen if it could just be made still. Props were chosen carefully. Favorite books, blankets, toys, a father's walking cane, a Bible held between two hands, one living, one lifeless. Sometimes a floral wreath was draped gently over the deceased's lap, signifying memory. Occasionally, their name was inscribed on a chalkboard in front of them, a gesture of honesty, a quiet label, gone, but still one of us. Photographers trained in this art understood the delicacy of the moment. They weren't there to document decay. They were there to preserve closeness. And so they worked with soft light. They retouched gently. A blush here, a little sharpness in the eyes. Some studios even painted open eyes on the closed lids of the dead, not to trick the living, but to give a sense of wakefulness, of one last gaze. The intention was never cruelty. It was remembrance dressed as familiarity. In group portraits, the family often presented itself as composed. Neat hair, formal attire, calm faces, but the silence within the image tells more than the faces do. You can sense the strain. The way a hand curls just a little tighter. The way a child turns slightly away from the camera, as if unsure how to smile when seated beside a brother who would never again speak. These tiny details, visible only when the photograph is studied long enough, carry the weight of unspoken love. These were not staged performances of joy. They were ritualized gestures of survival. To sit beside your dead and allow yourself to be seen, not weeping but enduring, was a form of emotional labor now rarely demanded. And yet it was done, again and again, by families who had no other way to hold on. In some images, the entire family looks directly at the camera, as if daring the viewer to look away. In others, only the living meet. The lens, the deceased stare softly into the distance, or lie with their eyes closed, as if the effect is dreamlike. It folds the living and the dead into the same quiet breath. There is no spectacle, no drama, just presence. This form of portraiture was particularly common in the mid to late 1800s, when death was a frequent guest. But photography had become just affordable enough to be accessible. The daguerreotype, then later the carte de visite and the cabinet card, offered ordinary families a chance to own a piece of permanence, and if the only time one could afford a photograph was after a death, then so be it. The image would do its work. What seems strange now? The idea of posing with the dead, as though nothing had happened, was at the time a gesture of deep respect. It was not denial. It was the refusal to abandon someone simply because they had stopped breathing. Families gathered around their dead not because they believed them still alive, but because they knew love didn't stop with the heartbeat. The camera captured that truth better than words ever could. Even when the portraits were not entirely lifelike, they still offered something vital. The dignity of being seen. The refusal to let someone vanish without documentation. The practice echoed older traditions, like the death mask or the painted posthumous portrait, but photography gave it a new immediacy, a realism that made absence hurt in a different way. The cultural language of mourning at the time was already highly structured. Widows wore black, households hung black crepe, mirrors were covered, clocks were stopped, and a certain hush fell over daily life. Photography entered into this structure, not to disrupt it, but to deepen it. The group portrait became an extension of grief, a physical artifact to hold when the voice had gone quiet. Children who grew up with such images might one day look at them and ask, "Which one is her?" And the answer might be given in a whisper. "That's your sister. She died before you were born. But look, she's still here, in this photo. You can see how much she looked like your art. You can see her dress, her hair. You can see her. There was comfort in that, in the idea that the dead could still be part of the family, not only in memory, but in image, that they could still share space at the table, still be mentioned in stories, still occupy a corner of the mantle. The photograph made that possible. It became a quiet talisman against erasure. The practice of group post-mortem portraits declined as medical care improved, and death became more clinical. The living no longer needed to sit beside the dead to remember them. Funerals became more formal, more separated from the home. Photography itself became more casual, more frequent, less precious, and with that shift, the one sacred image lost its singularity. But the photographs remain. They sit in boxes, in archives, in antique stores. They resurfaced on websites, in books, in art installations, and each time they are seen, they ask a silent question. How do we hold our dead? What does it mean to remember someone not just in thought, but in form? And what happens when we sit beside them one last time? Not to mourn, but to be together. In that question lies the heart of this strange, tender practice. Group portraits with the dead were never meant to disturb. They were meant to bind, to tether love to something visible, to let those left behind breathe a little easier, knowing that in some small, fragile way the family was still whole. And perhaps that is what these images still offer, a soft place to rest the eyes, a gentle reminder that grief is not always loud, that sometimes it is composed, sometimes it sits still for the camera. Sometimes it holds the hand of someone already gone and says nothing at all. They dressed in black, not just for sorrow, but for clarity. In the silver shadows of mourning photography, every element had meaning. Veils, gloves, flowers, backdrops, hands folded across the chest. It was a kind of spiritual scrim, a suggestion that the mourner walked in two realms, draped gently in the lap, resting lightly upon the deceased's shoulder. Every placement was intentional. When a child's hand was placed in a parent's, it was not just to suggest love, it was to echo a pose from biblical paintings. From old iconography of Christ and Mary, saints and martyrs, these were more than aesthetics. They were choices that placed the deceased in a timeless space, a child laid out with a crown of flowers around her head, a young man posed beside a book, his hand gently resting on its closed cover, as if the story had ended. These arrangements drew upon a vast visual heritage. Medieval tomb sculpture, Renaissance painting, Catholic relic traditions, all folded into the relatively modern medium of photography. A cameo brooch pinned to the dress of the widow, containing a miniature of the deceased. If they were painted open in post-production, it suggested a return gaze, a lingering spirit. Some mourners stared directly into the lens. Others looked away, down, or to the side, creating a sense of distance or contemplation. The eye line in a mourning photo was not arbitrary. It was part of the symbolic grammar. Who looked where, and who looked at whom, told a story. But for those who sat before the lens, the symbols carried meaning that was immediate and visceral. They were not performing grief. They were translating it, rendering it visible, making it legible in a way that words could not. These were tokens of memory, small objects given enormous emotional weight. In others, they were tucked away, brought out only on anniversaries or quiet nights. Either way, their presence shaped the memory of the lost one. The cross faintly sketched in the backdrop, the wreath of lilies encircling a baby's head, because they remind us that grief once had a visual language, that mourning was once allowed to take up space. Black space, silent space, symbolic space, that to grieve was to create, to place a hand just so, to choose a flower with care, to wear the veil, not to hide, but to speak. These details, so carefully arranged, whisper stories across the centuries, a sense that even in loss there is form, even in sorrow there is structure, and even now, in the age of casual snapshots and digital blur, we might still learn something from these images, about how to honor, about how to hold space, about how to speak in symbols when words will not come. Stories of how the living tried to hold the dead, not just with arms, but with meaning. The symbols within them served as mnemonics, reminders not just of who had died, but of how they were mourned, how they were loved. They understood that these sessions were not just about exposure times and framing. Candid snapshots replaced composed tableau. The language of flowers and veils gave way to informality. Death receded from the parlor into the hospital. The iconography went with it. But it did not vanish. It migrated into other forms. Paintings, poems, jewelry, dreams. They were emotional negotiations. To suggest a hand be placed here, a veil drawn back there. These were delicate acts. These elements were not simply sentimental. They were designed to soften the image for those who would view it in the years to come, to allow memory to rest on innocence rather than loss. For parents, especially mothers, these symbolic details became the only tangible trace of the child's being. The best photographers knew how to read a family's needs and offer arrangements that matched their mourning tone. It was less a job and more a form of midwifery for grief, helping the living bring memory into form. In some mourning portraits, The living family members held such objects instead of touching the deceased. Others preferred to seat the deceased in a chair among the living, as if still participating. The decision was often shaped by personal belief, family, custom, and the nature of the death. An accident called for solemnity. A long illness sometimes brought relief, a gentle release captured in serene expressions. The iconography shifted subtly depending on these contexts. The object became proxy for intimacy, a way to hold what had already begun to fade. What emerged was a form of visual theology, one that used symbols to speak where grief could not. Not quite heaven, not quite home, a threshold, a liminal place. The message was subtle but clear. The person in the photograph had gone beyond, but not so far that they could not be remembered within familiar architecture. They were reminders, not declarations. In Catholic regions, rosaries might be visible. In Protestant households, a Bible laid beside the deceased was more common. The religious symbols were not ostentatious. They were there as anchors, quiet affirmations that the image was not an end but a threshold. The living and the dead mirrored one another. In doing so, they blurred the boundaries. This too was part of the design, especially for women. The heavy veil over the face was a portable shroud, one that declared both modesty and sanctity, and how long one wore it carried social, spiritual, and emotional messages. Black signaled not just sadness, but solemnity, reverence. For some, it was worn for a year. For others, it became a lifelong mantle. In photographs, the clothing often appeared darker than in life, the tintypes and ambrotypes deepening the shadows. The effect was striking. A tableau of humans shrouded in darkness, and yet lit from within by the stillness of presence. The widow who wore it could be seen, but not reached. A ghost of her former self, half here, half with the dead. In photographs, the veil became texture, an obscuring gauze that made the face beneath look ethereal, faded, almost otherworldly. It was not designed for comfort. It was designed to speak, a language written in symbols and shades of silence. To look at a Victorian mourning photograph was not merely to see grief, but to read it, to trace it across the surface like embroidery threaded through shadow. It was a slow ritual, a visual theology stitched into fabric, gesture, and stillness. The mourning veil, for instance, was not simply a barrier between the grieving and the world. Then there were the hands, not idle, not careless, always arranged, folded prayerfully across the chest. Symbols of resurrection and purity wove their way through the frames. Lilies, white and solemn, spoke of innocence regained. Ivy meant fidelity. Wreath suggested the circle unbroken. Occasionally, a small lamb was included beside a child, not for sentiment, but for theology. The Lamb of God, the shepherd's flock, a soul returned to heaven. These symbols were not frivolous additions. They were affirmations, quiet declarations that the image was not merely a keepsake, but a sermon in light and shadow. Behind the posed figures, the backdrops told their own stories. Painted curtains, garden, columns and balustrades that seemed to echo classical ruins. In some mourning photos, The entire composition seems more allegory than documentation. Even clothing bore meaning beyond fashion. The strict codes of mourning attire in the 19th century meant that what one wore, crosses appeared, yes, but subtly, sometimes in the background, sometimes around a neck, sometimes held loosely in the hand. Some images contained more private symbols. A lock of hair, a handkerchief, eyes, or their absence, spoke volumes. If the deceased's eyes were left closed, it suggested sleep, peace. Photographers became interpreters of this grammar. Many were not simply artisans, but quiet guides through the ritual. Some families chose to be photographed beside the coffin, the lid open, the body at rest. Children were most often portrayed as sleeping, a flower in the hand, a ribbon in the hair, a doll placed gently nearby. It's easy to misread these images now as eerie, to flatten them into curiosity or morbid spectacle. In some households, these mourning portraits were kept displayed on mantels or in parlors. As photography became more common and mourning less formalized, the symbolism began to fade. The photographs remain, and in them the symbols still speak. The gloved hand resting on a closed book, the eyes gently shut beneath a delicate veil. And perhaps that is why the photographs still affect us. And in that visual quietude, there is something soothing, something steady. When the body grew still and the house went quiet, grief rarely stayed within its proper bounds. It crept, it wandered, it knocked on doors that should have remained shut. And in the late Victorian years, as mourning photography reached its symbolic height, a parallel hunger began to take shape, not just to remember the dead, but to speak to them, to conjure them, to see, if only for a moment, their outlines in the smoke. The veil between the worlds, already so thin from sorrow, began to flutter, and behind it something stirred. Spiritualism did not burst forth in chaos. It seeped, as most beliefs do, from many places at once. A quiet conversation held in a darkened parlor. A photograph developed with an unexpected figure in the corner. A woman, pale and veiled, who claimed her fingers trembled with messages from beyond. In a world already accustomed to posing with the dead, it was not such a leap to believe the dead might pose back. The Fox sisters are often credited as the beginning, with their raps and knocks echoing through a Hydesville cabin in 1848. But by the time their seances reached city drawing rooms, spiritualism had taken root in the soil of collective longing. This was not a faith of fire and brimstone. It was a faith of whispers, of fingers on planchettes and letters traced in soot. It offered something no priest or physician could: the possibility that love, once severed, might be mended again by shadow. Photography, already a medium of ghosts, stepped into this liminal space like a natural accomplice. If the camera could freeze a breath, a gesture, the light in an eye long stilled, then perhaps it could also reach further. Perhaps it could capture what the eye missed. The rise of spirit photography was less about trickery than about yearning. It began quietly, a faint blur, a smudge behind a mourner, a double exposure mistaken for visitation. And then it became deliberate. William H. Mumler is perhaps the most famous name among the spirit photographers. His studio in Boston drew mourners like moths, widows, Soldiers, mothers, children clutching mementos. They came to sit still and hope. Hope that behind their shoulder a face might appear faint, luminous, familiar. Some said they recognized the hands, the tilt of a jaw, the slight turn of the eye. Others wept without words. Whether they believed the image was real or not became secondary to what the image allowed them to feel. Many of these photographs have since been debunked, of course. Exposures layered with old negatives. Studio assistants draped in gauze, plates subtly reused. But the deception, if it was one, rarely broke the spell. Because, for many, the images were not about truth. They were about permission. Permission to mourn aloud. Permission to imagine that love was not severed by death. Only altered in form. Seances and photographs grew together like ivy vines twisting around the same beam. Families who sat for mourning portraits might later sit in circles, hands linked, waiting for a knock, a whisper, a chill in the air. Mediums, many of them women, became vessels. They offered not just messages from beyond, but a safe ritual, a space to weep, to believe, to feel less alone. The language of mourning expanded to include these shadows. The symbols crossed over, black veils remained, but now they hung in darkened rooms lit only by candles. The photographs gained new details. Ghostly figures hovering above the living, ectoplasmic threads issuing from mouths and eyes, all arranged with the same composure as traditional mourning portraits. The dead no longer lay still, they hovered, they lingered. In some circles, these practices were treated with reverence, in others, with skepticism. But few could deny the emotional current that passed through them, especially after the Civil War in America and later the Great War in Europe, when entire generations were swallowed by violence. The hunger to connect with the lost deepened. Mourning was no longer just a family ritual. It was a national condition. Spiritualist churches sprang up alongside photography studios. Mediums advertised in newspapers. Mourning etiquette now included the possibility of communication beyond the grave. Some families kept a separate room in the house, not for guests, but for spirits. A quiet space, draped and perfumed, with a chair always left empty. A place where the dead, if they chose, could return. Not all spirit photography was elaborate. Some images were gentle. A faint mist above a child's cradle. A hand resting beside the mourner's shoulder. A faded silhouette holding a flower. The details were often soft enough to allow projection. Viewers brought their own meanings, their own memories. The ghost became a mirror. Critics, of course, abounded. Scientists called it fraud. The church called it dangerous. But these arguments often missed the point. The images were not scientific proofs. They were relics, not unlike the bone fragments of saints kept in golden reliquaries. These photographs were held close, kissed, wept upon. They became part of the private liturgy of grief. And sometimes the stories behind the photographs were stranger than the images themselves. There are accounts of widows who claimed to dream of their husbands only after viewing a spirit portrait, of mothers who said the presence in the photo guided them through later childbirth, of orphans who wore the photograph of a ghost sibling in a locket until their own deaths. Whether true or not, the images became containers for experience, memory, hope. Photographers learned to navigate this space delicately. Some embraced the role of spiritual guides, offering not just portraits, but readings, messages, seances. Others denied any involvement in trickery, claiming the images emerged on their own. Still others treated the practice as art, a way of exploring absence, shadow, and the yearning built into every lens. The overlap between grief and belief grew tangled. Some mourners who had never stepped inside a church came to believe in spirits. Others, once devout, shifted their faith from the pulpit to the séance table. Mourning photography became part of this spiritual terrain, both anchor and doorway. A photograph was not proof of life after death, but it was proof of desire, of how deeply humans wished not to forget. The visual language of spirit photography was distinct. Unlike traditional mourning portraits, which emphasized stillness and composition, spirit images often had movement, wisps of light, curtains fluttering, faces that seemed to melt into shadow. The surreal became part of the aesthetic. Viewers knew the images were impossible. That was the point. Grief is impossible too, and yet we bear it. One of the most famous spirit photographs shows Mary Todd Lincoln seated, eyes downcast, with the faint figure of her husband, Abraham Lincoln, standing behind her, hands resting gently on her shoulders. Whether real or constructed, the image encapsulates the era's deepest longings for comfort, for return, for something beyond the silence of death. The afterlife, once a place of fire or reward, now took on a more domestic tone. The dead did not ascend with trumpets or descend with curses. They lingered. They sat beside us. They touched our hands in sleep. They waited quietly for us to call them back. The photographs reflected this shift. The dead looked not like saints, but like family. Not all spirit images were benign. Some were darker, faces contorted, figures cloaked in shadow, symbols that evoked not peace, but unease. These images often revealed the undercurrent of spiritualism, the ambiguity, the fear, that in calling out to the dead, we might summon more than we meant to. That grief, when opened too wide, might become something else. But most photographs remained tender. They showed a woman looking up toward the faint outline of a child, a man sitting quietly with the suggestion of another beside him. The images were less about ghosts than about presence. Absence shaped into light, memory made visible. Eventually, as with all things, the movement faded. Photography advanced. Spiritualism waned. Mourning became more private, more medicalized. The photographs were stored in boxes, forgotten. But they did not vanish. They waited. And today, when we see them again, the effect is strange. Not horror, but hush. Not disbelief, but recognition. We still want what they wanted, to remember, to hold on, to hope. In these photographs, the veil between grief and faith is not torn but gently parted. We glimpse something, not truth, perhaps, but a truth, that love does not end with death, that memory seeks form, that the camera, for a moment, let us pretend we were not alone. In the echoing silence of medieval chapels, where incense thickened the air and candles flickered like patient stars, there lay sometimes beneath altars, sometimes sealed in ornate boxes, the remains of the dead. Not just any dead, holy dead, saints, martyrs, miracle workers, their bones, blood, hair, and, in some rare cases, entire preserved bodies were venerated not as mere reminders of holiness, but as living reservoirs of divine power. These relics weren't passive tokens of memory, they were active agents of healing, protection, and grace. And in a time when medicine was uncertain and death was always near, some believed that the sacred body might do what herbs and prayers alone could not: restore life, or, at the very least, stave off its end. This was not medicine in the conventional sense, this was faith-bound pharmacology. Relic devotion in the medieval world created a curious overlap between spiritual veneration and bodily consumption. Touching a bone might heal a fever. Swallowing dust from a saint's tomb might cure a persistent cough. Mixing water with a fragment of holy skin ground and strained, of course, could relieve convulsions. One monk's journal records how pilgrims would scrape flakes of a saint's femur into wine, drink it, and report divine visions. In these moments, the body of the holy was more than symbolic. It was medicinal, and not entirely metaphorical. The idea wasn't new. Early Christian tradition had long placed value on martyrs' relics. When the body of Saint Polycarp was burned by Roman authorities in the 2nd century, his followers carefully collected the ash and bone fragments, treasuring them as more valuable than gold. But as the centuries passed, the practice evolved. By the time of the medieval period, Europe was dotted with churches claiming to house teeth of John the Baptist, fingers of Saint Catherine, or vials of Christ's blood. Competition for relics was fierce. So were the methods of acquiring them. Some were bought, some stolen, some fabricated entirely. It didn't always matter. What mattered was belief and the miracles that followed. Pilgrimage sites thrived on this faith. Towns that possessed powerful relics became centers of both spiritual and economic activity. Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, Cologne each owed its fame, at least in part, to the saints sleeping beneath their stones. But relics weren't just for distant destinations. They were also found in smaller parishes, private chapels, even family homes. Bits of cloth, finger bones, dried blood pressed into wax medallions, these were carried in pockets, sewn into garments, placed beside sick. They were physical proof of the divine on earth, available for those too poor, too weak, or too desperate to wait on prayer alone. And sometimes they were ingested. A practice emerged, whispered more than proclaimed, of scraping relics into consumable forms. Powdered saints, bone mixed with broth, water poured over holy objects and then drunk. Wax tablets, kissed by the relic itself, melted into oil, then rubbed into the skin. This was not the full-body cannibalism of battlefield surgery or apothecary. Harvested was subtler, more reverent, a kind of microdose of the miraculous, an act of faith disguised as treatment. Church authorities didn't always approve. Official doctrine emphasized the sanctity of relics, not their consumption. But, in practice, enforcement was lax. After all, if a dying child recovered after tasting a pinch of powdered martyr knuckle, who was going to argue with the results? In monasteries, relics were sometimes used during medical procedures. The Benedictines, known for their libraries and medicinal gardens, occasionally anointed the sick with oil touched to a saint's relic. In extreme cases, small bits of cloth that had once shrouded holy bodies were steeped in healing potions. These remedies were usually offered only after traditional treatments failed, but they were rarely refused. Even skeptical monks, trained in the logic of Aristotle and Galen, hesitated to deny a remedy that came wrapped in divine promise. Stories spread. A blind woman in Mainz who touched her tongue to a relic-laced wafer and claimed to see again. A nobleman's epilepsy soothed by sipping from a chalice that held a drop of saintly blood. A newborn in Venice who survived plague after being bathed in water that had kissed the skull of Saint Sebastian. These tales wove together miracle and medicine so tightly that it became difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. And it wasn't just the Christian world that practiced relic ingestion. In the Islamic world, the hair of the Prophet Muhammad, carefully preserved, was sometimes mixed into perfumes or oils used for healing. In Hindu traditions, remnants of saints or holy ashes from sacred fires were consumed as part of spiritual purification. The idea of sacred matter carrying power wasn't unique, was nearly universal. But medieval Europe, especially between the 11th and 15th centuries, elevated it to art. Guilds emerged that specialized in reliquaries, ornate containers for bones, teeth, and blood. These were not merely decorative. They were believed to preserve and amplify the relic's power. Gold, silver, crystal, enamel, all used to create homes for the holy dead. Some containers were shaped like the body part inside a gilded hand, holding a finger bone, a silver head encasing a skull. Others were shaped like tiny chapels, turning the sacred remains into architectural features. Pilgrims would often line up to kiss these containers, to press cloths against them, to take away a small imprint of sanctity. The term brandia was used to describe items that had been touched to relics, essentially spiritual surrogates. Some brandia were sold in markets, others given as alms. In times of plague or famine, these tokens became as prized as any. Potion or poultice. In some darker corners, rumors whispered of more literal consumption. There are fragmentary records of apothecaries selling powdered saints, tooth or mummy bone, not clearly differentiated from the broader materia medica. Whether these were genuine relics or cleverly marketed remains from anonymous corpses is unclear, but the implication was strong enough that church officials periodically issued condemnations, softly, cautiously, against such practices. The fear wasn't just desecration. It was the blurring of lines between miracle and marketplace, between reverence and commerce. Yet, for many medieval believers, that line had never been firm. The body was sacred, but it was also practical. Saints did not suffer and die to be sealed in boxes. They died to help, to intercede, to heal. And if that help came in a sip of relic water or a flake of sacred bone, then so be it. The faithful believed not in the material alone, but in what it represented. Divine intervention, hope made tangible. This belief system dovetailed, at times awkwardly, with emerging scientific curiosity. As the 15th century drew to a close, and Renaissance humanism began to spread, a new interest in anatomy and the physical body began to challenge the purely spiritual model of medicine. Dissection was still controversial, but medical students were beginning to ask, what, exactly, was inside the saint's body? What if the miracles had a biological cause? Could relics be studied, not just worshipped? For some, this was heresy. For others, it was evolution. In the shadow of this tension, relic consumption began to fade, not because belief diminished, but because the methods of medicine were changing. By the 16th century, powdered mumia vera became widely used in apothecaries, but it was more chemical curiosity than spiritual act. The ingestion of saints became increasingly a medieval memory, tender, strange, and quietly shelved as the world tilted toward reason. But even centuries later, the idea lingers. In old cathedrals, candles still burn before glass boxes holding splinters of rib and phials of darkened fluid. Pilgrims still kneel. Some still press handkerchiefs to the glass, fold them away like talismans. The line between symbol and substance is still blurred. The faith persists not always in flake or fluid, but in the deep hope that something ancient, something good, still dwells within the broken body of the past. As we move now toward the final chapter of this story, a world preparing to leave behind its bones, its blood, and its holy powders, will see how early modern Europe wrestled with the cannibalistic inheritance of its medieval age, how Enlightenment thinkers tried to explain or erase a legacy that included saints in the soup pot and holy men in the medicine chest. But for now, we rest in that long twilight, where the sacred still shimmered just beneath the skin, and where swallowing a saint might mean one more day of life. There are photographs that never leave you, not because they haunt, but because they hum, quiet and persistent, like a breath held just beneath the skin, and the images from the age of mourning, the portraits of the still and the silent, have continued to hum across centuries, folding themselves into new shapes, new meanings, new obsessions, and even now, in an age of saturation and scrolls of endless faces, we return again and again to the stillness of the dead. It begins in attics, perhaps, or in forgotten trunks left in the corner of antique shops, among yellowed lace and rusted tin, a box of stiff cards tied with ribbon, a face peering out that does not blink, and for a moment you do not know why you are looking, but you cannot stop. The gaze holds you, the eyes unseeing, but present, the mouth closed, not in pose, but in permanence, and something about that image, something about the weight of it, begins to settle in your chest like dust, and memory collectors will tell you they do not seek the dead for morbidity, they seek them for stillness, for the serenity that only comes when all other needs have fallen away. They seek a kind of honesty in these images, something the living rarely give, something unself-conscious, unperformed. The quiet of it speaks louder than laughter, louder than posed joy. There is no performance here, only presence, and so these photographs move again. Not through mourning parlors, but through catalogues and auctions, websites dedicated to death's artistry, Instagram pages with soft filters and whispered captions where strangers post the faces of the long gone and call them beautiful, and they are. Because beauty in death is not about symmetry or light, it is about silence. It is about the way time seems to stop in those images and allow you to breathe inside someone else's sorrow without being devoured by it. As Victorians, to have returned to these photographs, no longer dismissing them as oddities, but recognizing them as documents of care, of grief, of resistance in a world that often wanted mourning to be quiet and clean. These images said otherwise. They said, "I will hold her even now." They said, "He was loved." They said, this pain is real, and so am I, and artists have not stopped looking in the stillness. They find something more potent than motion. They find the architecture of absence. They find the shape that love leaves behind. And so, in films, in literature, in exhibitions, the dead return, again, not to frighten, not to shock, but to be remembered, to be known once more, not just as names, but as faces, as gestures, as the specific way a hand rests on a breastbone, or how a child's head tilts slightly against a velvet pillow. Gothic art owes much to these photographs, though it rarely says so out loud. The aesthetic of sorrow, of lace and shadow, of pale faces and heavy eyes, of rooms full of air that no one breathes, it all echoes from those images from the era when death was not a stranger but a guest, when mourning was not rushed but cultivated, and in those echoes we hear a longing, not just for beauty, but for permission, permission to feel deeply, to grieve without embarrassment, to remember without apology. There is also a certain modern irony in how these photographs endure. In a culture that fears death and yet obsesses over legacy, where we upload our lives, constantly chasing a permanence that eludes us, the dead in their stillness seem to mock that urgency. They remain. While we refresh, they watch while we scroll. And in their silence, they whisper something we have forgotten how to hear. Museums, to have begun to acknowledge the weight of these images, not just as curiosities, but as cultural artifacts. Exhibitions are mounted not just of the photographs, but of the practices that surrounded them, the rituals, the garments, the jewelry, the poems scratched into the backs of cabinet cards. And in this curation, there is a slow reverence, an understanding that this was once love, that this is still love there. Are debates, of course, and they are not simple. Should these photographs be shared? Should they be sold? Should the intimate mourning of one family be displayed for the curiosity of another? And these are not questions with easy answers, because the dead cannot consent, and yet they were once placed before the lens by hands that loved them, or needed to believe they could still be seen. Some argue that the display of these photographs is a violation. Others say it is a resurrection, and perhaps both are true, because history is rarely clean. It is a mirror cracked down the center, reflecting both reverence and discomfort. And in that fracture we see ourselves, we see what we value, we see what we fear. Ethical debates aside, the fact remains that these images move us, and not just those who study or collect, but anyone who has ever lost someone and wanted to see them again, even just once. Anyone who has ever held a photograph to their chest and pretended it was skin. Anyone who has whispered to a picture frame at midnight and waited for an answering this way. The legacy of post-mortem. Photography is not in the photographs themselves, but in the permission they give us to remember, without needing permission, the way they tell us that grief does not have to be hidden, that memory does not have to be quiet, that the dead do not stop being loved just because they have stopped breathing. And so we return to them even now, especially now when grief comes fast and quiet, when we are told to move on before the soil settles, when memorials are digital and mourning is scheduled like a meeting. We look at those old photographs and we remember how to sit still with loss, how to let it live beside us instead of beneath us, how to hold it like a child, not to fix it, but to comfort it. There is also a strange comfort in the physicality of those images in a world that is so often weightless. To hold a photograph that once sat on someone's mantle, that once passed through someone's Fingers that once caught the light of a morning candle is to hold a thread that stretches back through time. Not a rope, not a chain, just a thread, fine and golden, and trembling with the breath of every person who ever looked upon that face, and whispered their name. And when we sleep, when we dream, the dead come softly, not with terror, but with recognition, and perhaps it is those photographs that have kept them near. Perhaps it is those images that act as anchors, as doors, as small, fragile spells that say, "Come in, sit down, stay a while. I remember you so." The legacy is not just in what we see, but in how we see, in how we allow ourselves to be changed by the looking to be jiggled, by it to be reminded that grief is not the absence of love, but its final form, that mourning is not weakness, but memory, with its shoes off, sitting quietly beside us as we close our eyes and as we drift now into whatever dreams await us. May those faces stay with us, not to frighten, but to hold, to remind us that we too will be remembered, not for what we said, or built, or bought, but for how we were held, for the way we were loved, for the stillness we left behind, that hums long after the shutter clicks. Oh, sleep now, gentle listener, the lights are low, and the rooms are still, and somewhere behind your eyes the faces wait, not to speak, but to be seen, not to haunt, but to rest with you in the soft hush of everything. You do not have to say good night.